Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our SC Thrives Mental Health Matters. We would like to, this is the first Friday of every month. If you've been with us before at 11:30, we have a new topic and conversation each month. We are glad to have you with us today. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are SC Thrive, a nonprofit who leads South Carolinians to stability by providing innovative and efficient access to quality of life resources. Today, we'll be talking about how to listen non-judgmentally and why it's important. Our guest today is Miss Susan Conrad with the Chapman and Company Leadership Institute. She is based in St. Louis, Missouri. Welcome, Susan. We're glad to have you with us today. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Barbara. Glad to be here with you and all the South Carolinians. I'm just excited to participate. I actually am a partner at the Leadership Institute. I started out really as a traditional finance and business person. I was in the financial and merger acquisition field and ended up starting my own business. So maybe you might call me a serial entrepreneur, but did a lot of work with integrating organizations and really learned that not just from the finance side, but the secret to the success of our organizations was really building effective relationships. And so I kind of come at the world from that finance business acumen side, and then married up from what I call maybe a little more enlightened side on, the numbers just tell the story of what people are doing. So I'm really excited to be part of this today. And now at the Leadership Institute, helping organizations that we serve build thriving cultures. We develop leaders, and we really try to help people align their people strategy to their business strategy, because we know that when people are successful, organizations are successful, and it creates that wonderful virtuous cycle of business. So that's where I spend my time when I'm not mom to 3 young adults, and hopefully serving in a couple other capacities, but thrilled to be here and part of your community today.
Thank you so much. We are thrilled to have you with us. So hearing is one of the 5 senses. If the biological parts of our ears are working correctly, it happens automatically without any effort on our part. It is the physical act of our ear receiving sounds made by someone or something and sending a message to our brain. We hear things involuntarily all day long without even thinking about it. Listening, however, is intentional and it requires focused effort. It is a learned skill, even an art, some may say, involving the conscious processing of what we hear. While we may have been told in conversation, "I hear what you are saying," we may not always leave the interaction feeling as though we've really been listened to. Susan, how do we prepare our minds to listen non-judgmentally?
Good question. One of the best things we can do is really stop and ask ourselves, am I listening for my benefit, or am I listening for the other person, in service to the other person? And so really when we think about beginning those conversations, kind of clearing our brain and our mind of maybe all the other things that are going on, and just saying, okay, why am I here? What is my best role? And as a listener, can I really just suspend what I know and say, can I approach this conversation with some curiosity? And, start with, think about it as a blank sheet. I'm really just here to listen, to understand how I can best serve the other person. Drop your agenda. The good news is that also relieves you of the stress of having the right answer. And so, being able to show up and say, okay, let me just hear what you're saying. Let me really understand the facts and the feelings of what you're telling me.
Awesome. And sometimes that's easier said than done, for sure.
It is. We have a lot of things coming at us. The world is going fast and a lot of distractions. And so really being able to focus in and listen non-judgmentally is really a critical way to build those relationships.
Yes. So non-judgmental listening is about trying to really understand the other person, rather than just hearing the words that they're saying. It is about going beyond just hearing the words that are spoken, and involves understanding exactly what the other person is trying to communicate. Nonverbal communication plays a large part in our dialogues, and the words that are spoken only represent a small part of the whole message. Much of the message will be lost if the listener is not paying full attention to the speaker. The Morabian formula applies to communications that are about feelings and attitudes. And in such conversations, they say that 7% of the message, only 7% of the message in conversations pertaining to feelings and attitudes is in the words that are actually spoken. 38% of the message pertaining to feelings and attitudes are what they call paralinguistic, or the tone, if you will, and how the words are said. And 55% of the message is pertaining to the feelings and pertaining to feelings and attitudes is in the person's facial expression, their body language. You can read a lot from what they're saying and how they're saying it. It's important to remember that while hearing just requires your ears, active listening requires the whole body, as you can see in the illustration there. Susan, a lot of times we use negative body language that we're not even aware of, just unconsciously. What are some of the most common negative body language postures that people unconsciously use that impede genuine communication and connection and the establishment of caring and trust?
There's quite a few, and as to your point, we aren't even aware of what we're doing. There's the classic, the closed arm, approach, or sometimes people might just be cold, right? So we get that, but if we can be mindful of how we're showing up with a more open body language, as you see in the picture over here, I appear more accepting and open. Eye contact is a key one. When you're with someone and they're not looking at you, they're distracted, God love all these pieces of technology, looking at their phone and whatnot. Eye contact is so powerful to let people know that you're fully tuned in and present for what they have to say. You're there to hang on their every word and listen. And I know today in the virtual environment, it can be challenging, but we can also unfortunately see some poor behaviors in the virtual environment. You'll see people distracted. We can see their eyes on the screen. I can tell if you're looking at another screen, if you're maybe not paying attention. And so just being mindful even of our camera angle. Am I taking more of a power position? The classic stance when we were in person is somebody might have their hands on their hips. And so can I be mindful of what my hands are doing virtually and showing that I'm fully tuned in? Because sometimes we can be sending signals unintentionally. Even our facial expressions, the old the resting murder face, where you don't even realize that you're just paying attention to the video, and now we at least have a chance to say, hey, what's the feeling that I am giving off? Because as you mentioned in those statistics, only 7% of the communication is done with the words. Everything else is coming through in terms of our tone, the choice of words that we're using, and our body language. And so those nonverbals are really critically important to saying, am I self-aware, and realize that, the image that I'm giving off. And if you're not sure, ask somebody you trust to give you a little bit of feedback. How do you know if I'm fully present or not?
Awesome. That's some good advice there to ask, get some feedback from a good friend or a partner. The first thing we want to do when we want to engage with non-judgmental listening is to create a safe environment for a conversation to take place, which may mean finding a quiet place, a little sit out of the way at a coffee shop or on a couch where there's not a lot of people around. But at the very least, turning away from all those electronic distractions, the noise and the interruptions, where a person feels comfortable enough to speak openly without the fear of judgment. The speaker feels able to talk honestly in a trusting environment. And 3 conditions help to create this space: acceptance, genuineness, and empathy. We can all tell when someone is being genuine with us and when they're being empathetic. It doesn't take a lot of human skill to interpret that genuineness or empathy coming from another person. Before reaching out to an individual who may be experiencing a mental health challenge, to provide non-judgmental listening, it is helpful to evaluate your own frame of mind and ask yourself 3 questions. 1, are you prepared to express concern without judgment? 2, are you the best person to help this person? Because maybe you're not the best person. Maybe you're too close to the person because your relationships with your children, your parents, your partner, you may be too close to drop the judgment and set it aside. Or maybe you're not close enough for them to want to share personal details with you or for you to set aside the judgment. And 3, can you invest the appropriate amount of time in a conversation right now? We always want to, if we're going to, someone has something they want to share with us, they need a listening ear, we kind of need to set aside a time and a space for that to take place. Even though the other person's views may be different than ours, it is essential that we respect and accept them. We should be understanding of the other person's experiences, regardless of how they differ from our own. Susan, what are some ways that we can foster a caring environment for conversation in our workplaces to build some trust and rapport?
Well, as you approach this idea saying, hey, how do we create this space to have these conversations? One of the best ways to build that environment is to create it in these little micro experiences and not wait until there is maybe a bigger conversation that needs to be had. So can you incorporate ways to build connection in your existing routines? Can we encourage people to share and celebrate maybe in some of our regular meetings? We make time to say, hey, I want to acknowledge the good things that people are doing. Let people know that they are seen and valued. So it builds that sense of trust before we just sit down and say, I want to have this non-judgmental type of a conversation or maybe a courageous conversation. And so what can I do to build that connection in the existing routines I have is a great way. Making sure, I think that as you pointed out, that I am accepting. So recognizing my goal is not to find agreement. And so, when I'm having discussions in meetings, maybe my goal is to say, can I gather all of the opinions and the perspectives of people? So again, showing that acceptance piece in other interactions, in maybe inviting people to share their opinions and their feedback, it creates that sense of trust between people that builds that safe environment. And so how do I build that trust is I share a little bit about myself. So I'm willing to go first. And so I'm not necessarily keeping it, I call it the professional, distanced, surfacey type of conversation. I'm willing to share a little bit more about myself in our regular interactions, because then it makes me more approachable. I'm willing to be vulnerable and opens up the space for other people to do the same. And so again, it's can I do these in maybe little micro ways along the way that build the trust, so that when we do need to have that conversation or I see an opportunity to help, then I've got more of a relationship built with the individual before we just sit down and say, hey, let's have this conversation. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, Barbara, or if you had any
Yeah,
other.
definitely. I love that. The idea that those little micro moments that we sometimes take for granted, but are so important in building that environment along the way, brick by brick, if you will.
Right. I think one of the other things we can do is we think about how do we change up the way that we kind of are distanced from each other. I'm sitting in an office, and so I have people sitting on the other side of my desk, right? So can I come around, and it's just the act of sitting on the other side and saying, hey, we're going to sit here next to each other to have a conversation. Again, changes the space dynamics. And as you mentioned, I'm going to pull it up here. These darn things, get rid of. When somebody's coming in, you're having a conversation, one of the best things you can do is show them you're turning it over. You have their full, they have your full attention, or better yet, put it in the drawer. It'll be there when you get back to it. And so just really showing that I want to create this space that says it's okay to have a conversation and I'm not distracted. So you're sending the message that you're valuable. And when people feel valued, they're more likely to share and feel comfortable.
Awesome. And I like what you said too about the power dynamic of the desk. And one of the other things that we do at SC Thrive is we teach people to be benefits counselors to help them apply for things like SNAP and Medicaid and things like that. And we always tell people it is better if you have, the person sit next to you while you're helping them with the process, the application, rather than sit across the desk, because, they're but for the grace of God go I, who would also need to apply for that. And you're with them together. So I like that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Even though another person's views, their decisions, their beliefs, their behaviors may be different than our own, we're all unique individuals. It's essential, though, that we respect and accept them as long as they do not present harm to self or others, obviously. We should be open to understanding the other person's experiences, regardless of our own. Empathy is by far one of the most important characteristics of a good leader. Being able to see things from another's perspective, be it personally or professionally, is going to give you great insight into the lives of others, in their daily choices and their tasks, and allowing you to better understand who they are and maybe why they do what they do. There's a difference between sympathy and empathy, though. When you're sympathetic, you might feel pity for the other person's situation. You may still want to help, but you're coming at it from a different perspective. There's a distance between you and their experience. But when you're empathetic, you don't just know how someone else feels, you understand how they feel. You kind of internalize it and you feel it with them. Empathy and setting aside our own beliefs and misconceptions are so difficult. What are some of the things we as listeners can do to set aside those biases and stereotypes, our own cultural influences, to be more open and accepting of others when they're different from us?
Well, one of the things that I like to maybe frame this up a little bit with is the idea of I may know about a person, but I probably don't truly know the person. And so if I can keep that in mind and approach it with that curiosity to say, I may be familiar with similar situations, or maybe I've had similar ones myself, but the reality is it's not the same as the other person. So can I suspend that and say, how do I really get to know the person? How do I create a connection and understanding? And so approaching with good open-ended questions is a great way to say, hey, tell me a little bit more about yourself, or asking and responding in empathetic ways. So not necessarily saying, oh my gosh, let's hijack the conversation. That happened to me too, right? I need to set that aside and say, how am I really listening to what happened to you? And am I willing to connect to the facts, but also the feelings of what you're sharing? So watching for those signals, that tone and what people are saying. And so responding in ways that convey that empathy, that show that you have an understanding, that it's accepting, right? You're not passing judgment. So acknowledging how hard that might be, and recognizing the feelings in the other person that are being communicated. So that's really important versus responding in what I call non-empathetic ways. And I have to admit, I'm guilty of some of these, just thinking about you're passing judgment. You don't think you are, but you're using phrases like, oh, it'll be fine, right? It'll be all right, or this too shall pass, right? I'm dismissing and discounting the feelings of another person. And so instead of you think you're maybe trying to make it better and you're wanting to be helpful, it's actually having the opposite reaction. What I don't want to do is dismiss the severity of how they're feeling, because their reality is their truth. And so it's not about whether I agree with it or not. It's what's happening to them, and that's what they believe to be true. So I need to accept that. But then I also need to make sure that I'm conveying back that I hear the feelings and I can connect to them. I can let myself be vulnerable enough to go, that had to be really hard. And I can understand maybe why you might be feeling overwhelmed, right? So it's about keeping the conversation with the person who you're listening to and not hijacking it through your responses or through your questions. And so that empathy piece, as you mentioned, is so critical to building the foundation for a really good conversation where someone feels and hopefully is able to think and process in a way that they are better on the other side of it, right? The goal of this listening is to say, I'm here to help. And so I want to make sure that I'm responding in an empathetic way that says, I can hear you, I can see you, and I can appreciate you where you are and what you're doing. So being approachable and keeping that idea of saying you really don't know. And so how do I understand more through maybe some of my questions? And I know we'll talk about that further, but really just this idea of saying that empathy is critical to, if you do nothing else, make sure that you really tap into that piece.
Definitely. And just to let you all know, Eva has put in the chat, if you all have a chat question, feel free to ask for Susan or I. Feel free to use the chat. There's also the Q&A feature that you can submit some questions in as well. We're glad to have you with us today. I like what you said, Susan, about, the types of things that we say. For those who want to go deeper into that, in our mental health first aid class, we really spend a good bit of time talking about language and how we approach people and what are the right things to say that don't make it dismissive. So that's a great point there. Thank you so much.
Or the other piece is we don't want to say we want to avoid it. Like, that didn't really happen, right?
Right.
Or, so again, it's how do we show that, say, acknowledge that must have been hard for you, or say, I'm just happy here. I'm happy to listen. I appreciate you sharing that with me. Right. So you don't have to pass judgment on it. You don't have to, maybe there isn't a solution, and you're just being present for the person. And so being comfortable with that, it's uncomfortable for them. So for you to be comfortable in those moments and show that you can accept that emotion is kind of a sacred space. And so being able to do that is a real gift to the other person.
Definitely. Thank you. So most of us know what open-ended questions are. Those are those ones that you typically can't be answered with a one-word response or a short response. They allow a person to answer in any way or any depth that they choose. Open-ended questions can assist the other person in exploring aspects of themselves that were not initially available to the conscious mind, give them things that they didn't otherwise think about. But it's important to remember that while some questions can be beneficial, asking too many questions can make a person feel like they're being evaluated or interrogated, and they may also interrupt their train of thought and even change the course of their story. Also, the wrong questions can make a person feel as though they're not being listened to. Have you ever been telling a story to someone and then they asked you a question and you just kind of shook your head and like they weren't listening, they weren't paying attention? But door openers, we see the door open here. Door openers are a little bit different, and oftentimes they're more valuable in conversation. A door opener is a non-coercive invitation extended to another to talk, an invitation to get started, to say something about what he or she is thinking or feeling. Door openers are open-ended responses, and they might not even be questions. They may just be statements that do not convey that evaluation or judgment that we were talking about a few minutes ago. They can be generic, or they can be pertinent to a specific thing. A generic one allows the person the opportunity to express what is most pertinent to them in that moment. And specific door openers use that previous knowledge, that background of information of behaviors, to focus on a particular concern or issue that the person may be having. They can include observations. So in mental health first aid, we teach you all to be great noticers. They can include observations the listener has noticed. Door openers can encourage a person to expand and elaborate on their story, begin a conversation, and allow the listener to gain some insight. So some of us may not be as familiar with door openers, Susan, as we are with open-ended questions. So what are some good examples of door openers?
Well, one of my favorites is tell me more. And so rarely when someone comes in or shares maybe a problem or a situation, rarely do we get it right in the first 3 sentences, right? There's more to the story, there's more to the issue. And so being willing to say, tell me more, and not just taking that first bit of information as the whole story is a great one. You mentioned one, what is important to you about that? And so as someone maybe shares a few thoughts and some people are more expressive than others. If someone has using a lot of words, you might want to ask them, so why is that important to you? Or what about that is important to you is a good one. Go on is a simple way to just encourage people to keep going. They have a thought in their head and they have a direction. As you said, we don't want to interrupt or hijack their thinking. And so go on is a really good one. The other one that you might want to use is when you think about listening, and if you're truly paying attention. You can also use, be reflective for them and say, it's interesting. You've mentioned this person several times. Why do you think that is? Or you've used this word often. That's interesting. And pause. Right. So give people time to think and continue. And so that power of the pause is really impactful because it just gives, people need time to think. And sometimes we feel we have to keep things rolling and actually let the pace be set by the person who's doing the talking, and don't rush them. So when even your nonverbals can encourage them to go on more, and lean in, go, wow, right? And acknowledging those, like you said, we're not mining for data. This isn't to satisfy my need for information or an agenda that I have. I want to see where you want to go with it. By listening, I'm actually understanding how you're thinking and processing. So I'm going to learn a lot more if I'm able to just follow and encourage you to take this where you want to go, because I'm going to learn about what's important, why it matters, and what the impact is that it's having on you. So lots of good options, but my default is usually tell me more.
That is great. That is a good one that we can all, easy to remember, and it's easy for us to use, and we can use it with our kids or we can use it with our coworker.
Exactly.
Definitely. So reflective listening, we think of things that reflect. Maybe we see our reflection in a mirror, or our reflection in a lake that's serene. But reflective listening is careful listening to the speaker and kind of reiterate their message back to them, showing that you understood what they're feeling. A reflective listener listens for meaning, and they check in with the speaker to see that a statement has been correctly understood, not only heard, but understood. The goal is to improve that mutual understanding. A listener suspends judgment and personal reactions and stays closely focused on the speaker. It's important to do that mirroring on the 4 areas of the things that they're saying to you. 1 is the facts. 2 is what they think, what they feel, and what they want. So those 4 areas: the facts, their thoughts, their feelings, and their desires. What do they want to happen? And you want to keep reflecting back to that person until they agree that what you're reflecting back to them is what they really were trying to communicate with you, that you heard them correctly, that you understood their point of view. But from an early age, Susan, most of us are taught in school critical listening skills. It's one of those things that is great when you're applying for college. Oh, I've got critical listening skills. But how is reflective listening different? And how does reflective listening encourage the speaker?
Well, you point that out. The critical listening, we're basically taught to find the errors or the gaps in the logic. That's what critical thinking is, and it involves a lot of judgment. And where reflective listening is I'm here to make sure that I'm helping you understand, process your thinking, and I'm here to help you think through whatever the challenge or whatever the issue is. And so when I'm doing reflective listening, what I'm doing is helping you fine tune your thinking, not satisfy my objective. I'm here to say, okay, how do I, if I'm truly listening this way, I've got to make sure that I'm hearing the whole story, that I've got a good grasp of the situation, but my reflective listening also helps you get a good grasp of the situation. And so I'm allowing you to look at situations from maybe multiple perspectives that you hadn't considered before. So that reflective piece, that constantly tuning in and feeding back that you're on the same wavelength, allows the other person to make sure that they're thoroughly thinking through the situation and maybe are considering feelings that might be deeper. They might have other additional thoughts they hadn't processed before. Maybe it helps them recall some additional data or situations that influence how they're thinking. So again, it's you're helping them in this process versus the critical thinking for you to say, let me find the gaps in the logic, or in maybe the gaps in achieving my goals. So again, it's that mindset, but then also recognizing you're actually helping advance their thinking And that's really the goal of this opportunity, is to say, how can I help you think through and connect not only the options, but then the outcomes of some of the possibilities that you might be considering. And so again, focusing in on how do I help you advance your thinking is the goal of reflective listening.
That is great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So sometimes we may believe that we're being good listeners, but in reality, listening is more than waiting for our turn to talk. So like you said, we may be thinking of our one-up story, our thing that we can say that relates, and that's something that we did. Some of the common mistakes we make when we think we're being good listeners for other people: multitasking or checking our phones, emails, those little ding notifications that we become addicted to. Daydreaming or thinking of something else. It could be as simple of, what do I got to do for dinner? What am I going to pick up from the store? Well, the person speaking, you're kind of running down your mental to-do list for the rest of the day. Thinking of what to say next. And again, preparing that topper story for you. Asking about unimportant details, too many questions. Judging, we talked a lot about judging what that other person is saying. Listening for a specific goal or an outcome in mind. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see people make, Susan, when they think that they're being good listeners from their own perspective?
I call it the fake listening, and my kids call me out on this all the time, because I'm like, gotcha, and I'm doing all the facial nonverbals and that, all that good stuff, and then they're like, you didn't hear a word I said, and I'm like, yeah, no, I didn't. You're right. So I have to admit, I'm guilty myself. I think sometimes, like you said, we're busy. Biologically, we're wired to not be good listeners. And so it takes a lot of effort to really think about, how do I engage? Because my brain processes about 4 times the speed of what I can speak. And so my brain is going really fast. And I'm sure for all of you on this call right now, you're thinking about all the other things you have going. And so it takes a lot of energy to say, I am going to focus in on just listening, because I've got all this excess capacity in my head, about 75% more capacity to process. And so to redirect that takes some effort. That's why at the end of a long day, if you're at a conference and you've been listening intently all day, you can be exhausted and your body hardly moved out of the chair. And so what I see is a lot of people are always trying to come up with, I've got to come up with a good answer. I'm thinking about, what's the next question I need to ask? And so you need to just really quiet the mind, so to speak, and think through, how do I focus in here? Good news, you're relieved from having the answers. Nobody, if you're truly in service to listening, it will come to you because you've got better information. You've listened more intently, you've heard the thoughts and the feelings. And so trust me when I say, you'll have what you need to respond. You don't need to worry about asking the perfect question or having all of the answers. That's not your job. Your job is to truly listen to understand how to best help the person. And so I just encourage you to give yourself a break. Recognize that it is hard and it takes energy, and then say, okay, what can I do to really focus intently and think about it as the gift to the other person? That's one of the best things that you can do to build a relationship.
Awesome. I like that idea that you can just take that weight off of your shoulders, that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to come up with the solutions. A lot of times when you let people speak and you're just listening non-judgmentally, they'll come up with their own solutions just because they're able to process their thoughts by being heard.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
What are some of the ways that we can get better at blocking those distractions in our every busy lives? Because we all have so many things competing for our attention every day.
We do. And one of the pieces that you mentioned is, time is a really big challenge. We all only get 24 hours in a day. And there are times when we do need to listen, and we literally just don't have the time to devote to that. And so what I would say is, one of the best things you can do is be honest about, do you have the time to have the conversation? If someone is coming to you and, the classic, have you got a minute? I've never had a 1-minute conversation. And so if you don't have the time, don't rush them or don't half listen. So what you can do is say, I unfortunately don't right now, but I want to hear what you have to say. Could we get together and give another time, or tomorrow morning, this afternoon? It's more respectful to the other person, and it's going to result in a better experience for everyone involved, because people can tell when you're half listening and they feel rushed, or like they're looking past or listening past me to get to the next thing. So that's one of the things we can do, is just be honest if we have the time or we don't. I'm not saying you have to set aside 3 hours and get out a couch for people to lay down on, but if you need 15 minutes, then find a good 15 minutes and give people your full attention. And a lot of folks think that we don't have time for this. And I would argue that if you don't make time, you're going to have more issues to deal with. And so one of the best ways to get some of your time back is to really be intentional about your listening and those connection points, because chances are you're going to learn a lot more. As you mentioned, the other person is going to be able to do a lot of their own thinking. So it's going to build some capacity within them. And chances are they're going to walk away and may have come up with some new, more innovative solutions. So this idea of you don't have to have all the answers, this is a great way for you to also hear a whole bunch of other ideas. And so that innovation happens when people are thinking and exploring other thoughts and ideas. And so we don't want to thwart that, because there's new ways of thinking and doing things all the time. And we want to make sure that we're listening in service, but also mindful that giving people the space and time and not being distracted or consumed in our own thoughts about how we're going to respond. It's not about you, it's about the other person. And so I think I recognize that it's hard for a lot of reasons, but it's so powerful when we do it well. And I just share that it profoundly changed my relationship with my son. I thought I was listening, and I was always trying to figure out, tell him what to do. And when I really slowed down and said, I'm just going to listen to you, and I want to hear how's the best way to help you, he turned to me and he said, Mom, what is this voodoo magic you're trying with me? And I said, buddy, it's just listening. And I feel really bad that you don't even recognize it. And so it really is a game changer when we do it well, both at home and at work.
That is so good. Especially with, sometimes we take our families for granted. We're a little more intentional at work, and then our families get the second what's left of us. But that voodoo magic, I love that. That's a great. Eva, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes, we have one question. How could you help someone exhibit reflective listening when entering a difficult conversation, perhaps with a spouse or a coworker?
And so I want to make sure I understand the question correctly. How can we help someone exhibit reflective listening? So if I'm the person doing the listening, and it is a difficult conversation, one of the best things that you can do is acknowledge the emotion up front. So the elephant in the room, or maybe even your own feelings. So going in saying, let's say it's a challenging conversation at work, saying, this is hard for me, right? I want to make sure I do this well. And I know that we've got a lot of pressure on us to whatever, or there's been a lot of emotion. There are probably a lot of feelings around this. I might be feeling anxious. You might be feeling anxious. Acknowledging that up front relieves a little bit of that stress in the situation and allows you to then say, okay, but I want to declare my intent. I acknowledge the feeling, and now I want to have a really good conversation. I'm here to listen because I'm here to help, and letting people know why you're there. That's what I'd offer as a starting point. Barbara, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I love that as well, because a lot of times, especially in the workplace, in the workplace or with our spouse or our children or whoever, it's difficult for us to acknowledge that elephant in the room and just start out going, this is going to be hard, but I care enough about you to work through together what it is that this hard thing that we have to talk about. So I just love that, to just start with that acknowledgement. I think that in itself communicates caring and empathy to set the whole conversation in a better place. The other thing I think it helps, especially, and we teach this in mental health first aid also, is that just the act of sitting down kind of de-escalates difficult situations. And we may be quick at work or even at home to be standing up and have these conversations, but just the simple act of sitting It kind of de-escalates everything, and it puts people on a softer, gentler space than if they're standing with each other.
We have
Bring up a
another.
good, oh, I was just
Sorry.
going to add to that real quick. You bring up a really good point about our physical proximity to each other. And so that idea of coming around to the other side of the table and sitting side by side is another de-escalator, where it's not maybe supervisor and team member, or you're more peer-to-peer. We're here to work on this together is another good one.
And if they're at the same level, if one person is standing and one person is sitting, there's that power dynamic, the same way there's a power dynamic across the desk. But if they are both, at the same level, they're both sitting down next to each other, then that takes away some of that difficultness.
Yeah. Good point.
Eva, you said there was another question?
Yes, but you just covered it.
Okay. It says, Dan says, much of our interactions is by telephone, even in crisis situation. Is there a different approach for telephone listening when you can't have face-to-face conversations?
What are your thoughts, Barbara?
I think that elephant in the room acknowledgement at the beginning is important as well. But the other thing is that people can hear, I think through the telephone, people can hear your voice. They can hear your facial expressions. So as just to be mindful of what your voice sounds like. I watched a webinar a couple of weeks ago about from a voice coach, and he talked about the different levels of, from high to low to volume and all of those types of things that really be mindful of. And you can communicate a lot over the phone. Obviously, you're losing the body language and the facial expressions, but a phone conversation is way better than an email or a text conversation because you lose so much in that.
Right. I would just add, I think that I remember one of my first jobs in high school, I was a receptionist, and the woman who hired me said, I want you to answer the phone with a smile every time. And she said, people hear that. And so even though they can't see you, and this is, I've been working a long time. That's all I'll say about that. Back in the dark ages when we had phones and no video. But they can hear that. I think the other piece, especially if you're on the phone, is to, you need to use your words very carefully. So even if you're just listening and it's quiet, it's good to remind people, I'm here, I'm listening. And those acknowledgments that you would do with nonverbals, with your head nods, maybe, or your ahas, those kind of things. It's really important that you're clear on the phone. And then that other piece would be pacing. How am I, if someone is excited, I may not want to mirror that excitement or that anxiety. So how do I mirror maybe a little bit more calm pacing in my speech and my tone, quiet down a little bit. And so you can regulate to your point, you can regulate your tone, the words, and the pace with which you're saying things on the phone. But you need to be a little bit more specific because they can't see you. And so you need to let them know if it's something you're doing that with a nonverbal, try to make it verbal for them on the phone.
Definitely. And that takes practice. It's not something that we can just go, oh yeah, I'm going to do that on my next phone call. I think it's something that you need to practice and work on. It's a learned skill for sure. Great questions. Thank you. And always, audience, feel free to put some questions in the chat. Originally, when I was putting this presentation together, I was just going to have a blank screen, but I thought that we needed a little word in there. People might think it was an error, but most of us know that it's important to be silent when the other person is speaking. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, keep our mouth closed. But what about when they stop talking? One of the most difficult components of non-judgmental listening is silence, or the power of the pause, as we like to call it in mental health first aid. Appropriately used, silence can be a very powerful tool in conversation. Research says that in the United States, and a difference by culture and country, but in the United States, after 4 seconds of a prolonged silence in a conversation, it becomes awkward. And see, there's that 4 seconds. But even if through those 4 seconds, you may not feel like much, or like, oh, only 4 seconds, that'll pass really quick. But when nobody says anything for a few vital seconds, it can feel like a painfully long eternity. And that's precisely why it works, because somebody is going to want to break the silence because of the social anxiety that that silence causes. And as long as you are the listener, it isn't you who's breaking the silence and filling in the blanks for someone, that silence becomes critical because it forces that person to reflect longer, more deeply. We just need to, as listeners, resist the urge to be the one to fill up that silent space with chatter. Silence is important to helping the other person organize their thoughts and figure out what they want to say. It helps them to reflect on what they've already said and maybe, elaborate more or reiterate something that they didn't feel was communicated well. Susan, how do we know when it's appropriate to use silence in a conversation and it just isn't one of these awkward things that's sitting there without purpose?
Well, it is hard. And as a highly expressive person myself, it can be a real challenge. To my less expressive friends, I appreciate your mastery of silence. But one of the ways that you can tell that it is really appropriate and you just want to let this play out and be quiet is when someone looks away. You can tell when someone is thinking because chances are they're looking for the answer. I don't know why they look to the ceiling, they look to the side, maybe they look down, but when they start thinking, they will break eye contact with you. And what you can do is let them have that moment. Let them process their thoughts. You don't want to interrupt that. And when they're ready, they're going to come back and look directly at you. And you'll know that it's a good opportunity to either ask a question or they probably have something to say because you need to give people time to think. And so that silence, like you said, can feel awkward, but it's one of the best things you can do to help advance someone's thinking is let them process their thoughts. Some people are external processors. They use a lot of words and they fill up that airtime. Some people need the quiet and they process it internally. And so we need to give them that space and be comfortable with it. And then, if you might use one of your door openers, if it goes on an extended period of time, you could say, so what are you thinking? Tell me more. What's top of mind for you now? But maybe they've processed some of their thoughts. What's your freshest thinking on that? Right? So again, I want to keep that conversation with them. The ownership of the conversation is with them. But getting comfortable with that silence is very powerful when we think about what's the real purpose here is I'm trying to help you advance your thinking.
Awesome. Like I said, that's another thing that takes practice to just get comfortable in that space.
The other piece is resist the urge. I hate to be tailgated on the road. If the same thing happens in conversations, we're so quick to fill in and share a thought. And it's almost like tailgating in the conversation. And so we really need to even slow ourselves down just a little bit and give it a beat and collect your thoughts. You need maybe a minute to think about what's the right next question. We don't want to ask the wrong question. I was in this a conversation and someone shared they were talking about it was a very difficult day and they had some small children, but they unfortunately had to put their dog down that day. Oh. And the person with us in the conversation said, well, how much did that cost? Right? Not the right question, not the right time for that question. And so just pause, think, check your question, give yourself that gift of silence as well to say, okay, what's the right next question for me to ask?
Definitely. Linda Lucas in the chat has asked, is it okay to say, I hear you thinking?
Absolutely. You're acknowledging the feelings and you're reflecting back that you see them, right? And what they're doing. So I think that's an excellent response. I might have to borrow that one, Linda. I'm going to take that one with me.
I'm going to borrow the tailgating idea. That's a beautiful visual. Visuals and analogies, they always help us to remember things. And that tailgating in conversation, the way one would tailgate in traffic, that is a great analogy. We always want to fill that chatter. And sometimes we'll take the story and we'll say things that we think the person's thinking and then we take it in a whole different direction than the person was actually thinking. So as you had mentioned earlier, Susan, it's listening non-judgmentally is an invaluable gift that you can give to another person. Helping that person to feel heard, understood, and acknowledged can make all the difference in their life. In our mental health first aid action plan, we talk about the different steps, and listening non-judgmentally is just one of those steps. But in my opinion, it could be the most important step, because if a person feels that they've been heard, understood, and acknowledged, they feel that their thoughts and their feelings have been validated, that may be all that person needs to avert a mental health challenge or crisis. They just need that listening. Effective listening brings many benefits to our relationships. It leads to fewer misunderstandings, errors, less time being wasted. It can also solve problems in our relationships, our interactions, improve our ability to negotiate. It helps us to avoid conflict. That'll be our topic next month. For those of you that come with us each month is conflict resolution. Perhaps most importantly, though, non-judgmental listening builds those relationships and facilitates communication. This is true both in the workplace and outside of the workplace. Active listening serves the purpose of earning the trust of others and helping you to understand their situations. It comprises both the desire to comprehend and understand, as well as to offer that support and the empathy to the speaker. Finally, it validates the speaker and it makes them want to speak longer. Do you know there's people in your life? Think of the people in your life who you love to talk to. Who are those people in your life, and what are those skills that they have that make you want to talk to them so much? It can make you want to speak longer and set the tone for this conversation, this interaction, but also future interactions with you or even with other people in their life. And maybe they'll think of, maybe you can be one of those people who they think of at some point, and they can reflect those listening skills that they watched you exhibit. Now, Susan, to kind of wrap things up here, if someone wanted to improve their listening skills, what is the one thing you would recommend that they focus on first?
I would offer the first thing to focus in on is yourself. Be mindful of how much time are you talking versus how much time you're listening. And you can do that, but think about maybe the next meeting you have or the next interaction you have. And just draw a little pie chart and think about, okay, if this is 100% of my time in this meeting, how much of the time did I do the talking? How much of the time did I listen? And being more aware of that allows you to then make some more intentional choices in your interactions. And so if it's a team meeting or it's dinner around the table, get the conversation started and ask maybe a question and then listen. See what happens. You're going to learn a lot more. You don't learn anything when you're talking. So really thinking, how can I practice listening in all kinds of areas of my life so that when I have these opportunities and I would say more critical conversations, it allows you to be more intentional about how you show up as a really good, non-judgmental, reflective listener. So draw that little pie chart or, up in the corner of your notebook or your pad of paper, and just kind of rate yourself. Be observant for the next week and see where you are. And then you can say, okay, where do I have an opportunity to be better? And then use some of these skills, Barbara, that you've laid out here and the wonderful resources that I know you're going to share to say, okay, where's my opportunity? What's one or two things I could do differently to make that more effective?
That's awesome. I love that. Checking in. Our CEO likes to do a weekly check-in, and she often gives us tasks to kind of self-evaluate on things like that. But that's great to just draw that little pie chart and say, how much of the time did I speak and how much of the time did I listen? Because so many times we feel like in order to be the most important person in the room, we have to do all the speaking. But oftentimes, if we're the most important person in the room, we're doing all the listening. That's great.
Well said. Well said.
So we did want to share some resources with you. And Susan, if you would tell us a little bit about, you are with the Chapman and Company Leadership Institute, but I would also like you to tell us a little bit about the Chapman Foundation for Caring Communities. We had a speaker, Julie Chapman, actually, one of the daughters of Mr. Chapman, at our annual training in 2019. She was one of our guest speakers. So if you could just tell us, our community, a little bit more about that.
Sure. So the Chapman Foundation for Caring Communities is our nonprofit community outreach arm. So it's a sister organization of ours. We all share and come from the same foundation around building environments where people thrive. And listening is a key element of that. And so the Chapman Foundation spends its efforts in helping communities access a lot of the training resources and connectivity for people who are maybe in, I would say, first responder roles, educator roles, roles where people may not be have the opportunity to attend training through their organization. And so they're providing different training sessions. Usually they're multi-day events where people are connecting. So it's a great for community influencers and great opportunity for community to strengthen its network, but there's no cost to attending those classes. And so you can go to their website and register for those. And recently they updated and added quite a few virtual tools as well. And so we're fortunate to have different locations all over the country. South Carolina happens to have a really good chapter. And so Julie is a phenomenal leader and a person that I've worked alongside for several years, and she's just fantastic. So the more you can listen to her, the better off you are. And she's wonderful. But we also have, groups in Colorado and St. Louis and Dallas and Texas. And so just really encourage people to take advantage of the resources they make available. It was started as a result of Bob's wife, actually, Cynthia Chapman, said, I love what you're doing inside the organization. Isn't it a shame that more people don't have access to this? And Bob, God love him, said, well, what would you do about it? Right? Asked a nice open-ended question. And Cynthia had a few ideas. And so out of that was born this foundation to say, okay, one of our contributions back to the world is to make the good listening skills, the good customer service skills, that whole idea of building really strong relationships available to anybody who's interested in pursuing it. So we're very proud of that group and love sharing ideas back and forth and supporting them. So really encourage you to check out that website. And also you're welcome to check out ours as well. We do our best to publish resources so that people can take it and use it. We wouldn't put it out there if we didn't want you to take advantage of it. So
definitely. And you told us a little bit about, you have a virtual classroom on your website as well?
We do. So with COVID, the world changed. We used to be all in person, and we said, to really live our mission, we need to find a way to continue to connect and impact the world. And so we converted all of our in-person content to small virtual classroom content. It's live and interactive. So people are meeting other leaders from across the country in a variety of industries. And these sessions are usually 60 minutes long. We have a few that are a little shorter and a few that are a little longer. But our virtual classroom helps really, how are we developing leaders, and not so much informal leadership roles. While that happens, we see everyone has an opportunity to positively influence others. And so we want to make sure that those resources are available to anybody who's looking for them. So you're welcome to check out our website. There's a link to the virtual classroom that does a much better explanation than I do.
Definitely. And you said, not necessarily formal leaders, because you can be a leader without having that title. Leadership is definitely not a title, but it's a way you behave. And I just wanted to share this book with everybody. I had the privilege, I say, of listening to Bob Chapman speak, and he is just, you will be transformed if you ever have the opportunity to hear him speak. And this was a book that he co-wrote, and it's called Everybody Matters. And this is kind of the basis for the Chapman Leadership Institute and the basis for the Our Caring Communities Foundation. But I highly encourage it. And the words there, I'm just going to read them to you all because I think they're so powerful. Is everybody wants to do better. Trust them. Leaders are everywhere. Find them. People achieve good things, big and small, every day. Celebrate them. Some people wish things were different. Listen to them. Everybody matters. Show them. And I just think that is just a wonderful book. But we would like to hear from you today and hear about, if you don't have any more questions, if you do, you can put them in the chat and we'll attend to those quickly. But our producer, Eva, will put in the chat our link to surveymonkey.com. And we would ask you to just give us some feedback on today's episode. Let us know if you liked the topic, if you liked the speaker, and how we did for you today. Hopefully it was time well spent in your opinion. We thank you so much for that. I do want to give a nod to, we referenced several times throughout the our talk today are mental health first aid classes. We offer both the adult and youth certification. So this is an internationally recognized certificate that is a 3-year certificate. And we are lucky enough to have funding from the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Foundation of South Carolina to provide these classes to you at no cost for you as the participant taking the classes and earning these certifications. The link is there in the underneath the picture there. There's not an attendance certificate for today, Don, but you do, like I said, if you come to the mental health first aid training, that is a 3-year internationally recognized certificate. It's a great thing to put on your resume or to, hang the certificate in your office. We do encourage that as well. And if you don't have time, you can take a picture of the website here, or you can visit our website at scthrive.org for registration. I also want, whoops, went a little fast there. I also want to give a nod to our annual training. Every year we have a conference for nonprofit leaders and educators and public sector workers, healthcare workers across the state of South Carolina and beyond even sometimes. So this is the last week in September 27th and 28th is our annual training this year. And we hope that COVID will stay in check and we'll be able to do this in person in Charleston, South Carolina. So we hope that you will consider joining us. Our topic this year is unraveling the social determinants of health. So those are all those things that we don't think about that are related to how our health is, like our education, our background, the community that we live in, all of those things that we don't always think about related to our health. We do want to give a nod before we let you go to our sponsors. Those are the individuals that help to make this happen and help us to run all of our programs here at SC Thrive. We thank you for spending your lunch hour with us today. We hope that you'll stay connected with us. We are on scthrive.org, and you can connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And this recording will be posted on our YouTube and our Instagram pages after we leave you today. I also want to note the 1-800 number, that 1-800-726-8774. That is our contact center or our call center. And that is where you can get connected and get your people connected with things like SNAP and Medicaid and things like that as well. So we thank you so much. We thank you to Susan, our wonderful guest. We so appreciate you being with us today, and we hope that you all have a great weekend.